We're going to look in this lecture at the chapter titled Encounter, Contact, and the Clash of Cultures. Basically, the age of exploration from 1400 to 1650. Remember, the Renaissance started in 1400, and in 1453, the Ottomans taking Constantinople ultimately closes the Silk Road and effectively shuts down travel to the east, and that will lead to trying to find new ways to circumnavigate to get to India and to China and to the riches that can be made there as a trader. The other things that we look at in this chapter, which is a short chapter, they give us a kind of quick look around the world at Africa. We had done that earlier after chapter 6. We looked at Sub-Saharan African culture, and most of it in here I've talked about, except maybe I want to go in a little bit more into African music and griots, and also a little bit on African literature, which was not in this lecture. And then we talk about what's going on in the New World, now that it's mentioned because it's been discovered by Europeans. And they talk about Native Americans, and then they go into Mesoamerica and South America, a little bit on the Olmecs, a little bit on the Mayans, and a little bit on the Aztecs. I have a separate lecture on that. I'll go through bits and pieces of it. And then also a little bit on the Incas. And I think in the future, we're going to be getting a lot more information on South America, and in particular Peru, which seems as if they are discovering older and older artifacts and civilizations and things like the Nazca lines. And I suspect there'll be a revision in what we know about South American prehistoric society, Paleolithic and Neolithic society. That's my suspicion. For our discussion, you're going to watch a film, and a film by one of my very favorite filmmakers, director, and also actor, Werner Herzog. Herzog is a German director. He is a director of a number of, I think, important films. He's also an actor. You may have seen him in some movies in the Marvel Universe. And we are going to watch Agir, the Wrath of God. And what we're looking at here is a film shot like a documentary, and Herzog is also a documentary filmmaker. It looks like a documentary, but it's about insanity and greed and the chase by Spanish conquistadors into looking for a city of gold. And the opening shot of Agir is spectacular. The mountain where Machu Picchu is across from. And it is perfectly, one half is clear, one half is mist, and we see these little tiny, what looks like ants, and this long procession of plate-armored Spanish conquistadors trying to drag cannons and completely unprepared for what the jungles are in South America, as they are on this insane quest for gold. And I want you to watch this not only as a film and critique of a film, but also I think as a probably very close way that this might have really looked. The characters are flawed and dirty, and it is quite a ride. And a film made for $250,000, really, really cheap, even back then in the early 70s. And the film and the trip down the river is one of the major influences later in a film called Apocalypse Now that was a very popular American film, real great cult film at this point, that is also about the river and influenced by the river, made by Francis Ford Coppola. Okay, let's get into the age of exploration. So in the Renaissance, this was Europe's first era of exploration and expansion, and the greatest trans-Eurasian travel days since the Roman Empire. In the years between 1400 and 1650, imperial ambition, commerce, curiosity, and maritime technology combined to ignite a program of outreach by which Europeans make direct contact with populations of Africa and the Americas. Endowed with illustrious histories of their own, Africa and the Americas confronted the Europeans with unique traditions, many of which were radically different from that of Western Europe. Perceiving these older civilizations as backwards and inferior, Western Europeans often misunderstood and willfully destroyed their culture and landmark. So the encounter, the direct meeting of cultures, involves confrontation and conflict, but also contributed to a rise of global independence and the beginning of a Western-dominated world system. So all of this travel. So around the year 1000, we start to see long-range trade, religious pilgrimage, missionary activity, curiosity, and crusades, and cross-cultural contact between East and West. Arab merchants dominated the water routes in the Mediterranean and the Red and the Arabian Seas and eastward towards the Indian Ocean. Camel caravans took Arab merchants across Asia over desert highways of northern Africa, and Muslim carried goods from India to Anatolia. And Mongol tribes, newly converted to Islam, traversed the wide, vast Asian Silk Road. Franciscans will come into China and make possible, remember St. Francis the Franciscans, and make possible a vast mingling of religious beliefs: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Confucius, and Buddhist. Here we see the Silk Route here. Here we see the Ottoman Empire. So, let's just hold on to this slide here for a second. Okay, so when the court of Chinese Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan from 1215 to 1294, the emperor was a patron of cross-cultural dialogue. Marco Polo served the Chinese ruler for 17 years before returning to Italy, where he eventually narrates his travels to a fellow prisoner of war in Genoa. The fabulous nature of his account made the West look poor and backwards compared to the Chinese emperor. This brought Marco instant fame and was established by a romantic writer who recorded the Venetian Marco's oral narrative into the best-selling The Travels of Marco Polo in 1299. So Marco Polo's description of China's prosperity and sophistication might have been exaggerated. The Mongol rule will come to an end in 1368. China pursues ambitious policies of outreach during a brief period from 1405 to 1433, but is losing control politically and ultimately will shut down its borders, much like Japan. When they were exploring, 317 Chinese ships, the largest wooden vessels constructed anywhere in the world, with 28,000 men, sailed the Indian Ocean to the coasts of India and Africa. We're not sure exactly why they abandoned the program, but that's exactly what happened. European expansion after 1450 launched a program of outreach, and in 1453, that expansion found real difficulties when the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople and ended the 1,000-year reign of the Byzantines, the Eastern Greek Orthodox Empire. At the height of Ottoman power, as the Turkish presence in Southwest Asia threatened the safety of European overland caravans, Westerners are exploring other ways to get around the world. And that's when we begin to see that perhaps rather than traveling across land or through the waterways here, that perhaps there is a way around Africa that will ultimately lead to India. Now, it's going to take a real desire for gold and greed and slaves and spices, commodities in Africa and Asia that is going to cause the enormous risks and costs in building all of these ships. So the technology of long distance travel is helped out in early 15th century Latin translation of Greek Ptolemy's map making. And they continue to organize geographic space with latitude and longitude. The Portuguese, encouraged by Prince Henry the Navigator, who is king from 1394 to 1460, came to produce maps and charts that exceeded the accuracy of those drafted by classical and Muslim cartographers. Renaissance Europeans improved on older Arab navigation devices such as the compass and the astrolabe, an instrument that fixes latitude. Portugal and Spain adopted the Arab lantine sail. And you see the triangular kind of sail here in that bottom image. And they built 2- and 3-masted caravels with multiple sails that were faster, safer, and more practical for rough ocean travel than oar-driven galleys that sailed the Mediterranean. Also, they are outfitted with brass cannons to fend off enemy attack. And then sailors are able to reach the Congo in West Africa by 1483. 5 years later, Bartholomew Diaz opens up Portugal's sea road to India by rounding the southern tip of Africa. In 1498, Vasco da Gama navigates across the Indian Ocean to establish Portuguese trading posts in India. In 1509, the Portuguese were able to eliminate completely Muslim competition in India. While the Portuguese had reached India by sailing eastward, the rulers of Spain hired an Italian, Christopher Columbus, to sail west in search of an all-water route to China. And this is where he comes across the Americas that no Europeans had ever suspected had even existed. On their way to establishing their maritime empires, Portugal and Spain initiated an era of exploration and cross-cultural encounters which would transform the entire world. Again, in search of Chinese porcelain, in search of silk. As I said, it's map making, better ship making that's going to help this happen. And then also, I think as they reach these new worlds, in terms of the Europeans' kind of destructive influences, part of them are religious factors and the belief of the superiority, not only of their culture, but their religion, and after the Reformation, their form of the religion as well. Of course, Spain is bringing Catholicism to the New World, and then other countries are going to bring the Calvinists and the Anabaptists and the other reformative religions. So one of the things that happens here that is pretty important to understand is known as the Columbian Exchange. So the Columbian Exchange is the search for Mexican gold, and after the conquest of the Incas, Peruvian silver, that were not only sources of wealth for the conquerors, but also they turn into ruthless exploitation of native populations, enslaving them as miners and field laborers. During the 16th century, in the 1500s, entire populations of Native Americans were destroyed from the effects of diseases like smallpox and measles and decades of inhumane treatment. When Hernan Cortez arrives, Mexico's population was approximately 25 million. By 1600, it had declined to 1 million. Disease traveled from the Americans to Europe as well, as European soldiers carried syphilis from the New World to the Old. Metalworking technology, guns, and other weaponries came to the Americas with Christianity and Christian missionaries. And we call this the Columbian Exchange, the interchange of goods and products between Western Europe and the Americans. Europe's introduced to the Americas horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, wheat, barley, oats, onions, lettuce, sugarcane, and various fruits, including peaches, pears, and citrus. From America, Western Europe is introduced to corn, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, chocolate, vanilla, tobacco, avocados, peanuts, pineapples, and beans and pumpkins. And then ultimately, this mixture of culture and biology will also bring a new caste system to Mexico, a mestizo, a genetic blend of Europe and Native Americans, and also Creole people as well, mixed populations. So we could see definitely, I think, some good in terms of, well, I certainly can't imagine Europe without tobacco, for example, and I can't imagine America without horses. But obviously, again, what is benefited, we also have to weigh what is disastrous in this program. The next part of the chapter, again, because I think the limits of this 450-page textbook is that the humanities is really defined, I think, mostly through Western culture. And so it's trying still to give us an overview of culture, but the majority of the book is Western culture. So every chapter we get maybe a page or two of maybe the tale of Genji, or Hinduism and Hindu sculpture, or Buddhism, maybe comparing Buddhism and Confucius to Plato, perhaps. And here I think we get a similar thing in this chapter, kind of just who are and what are some of these other cultures, but still keeping the narrative, speeding us towards the Enlightenment and towards modern Western culture. I guess it's hard in a single book like this to get everything maybe as well as it could. So Africa is staying independent even after 600 AD with the Muslim conquest of Africa, preserving local traditions and culture and 800 native languages. They vary from small villages to large cities to empires. Africans have a kinship system, an extended group family dependent on each other for survival. They have chiefs and elders, hereditary or elected ruled clans who have semi-divine status. The living, the dead, and the unborn are linked in a single cohesive community. Animism, life is in everything. Dead natural forces act as guides, and ritual is important. Ghana has a vast empire, and they are exporting gold and iron and slavery and slaves, and they are importing salt, which is an essential preservative and flavor and antibiotic. And then in 1000, Ghana will fall to Muslims. In African literature, which is oral almost until the 1800s, Arab scholars begin to write stories down. Now, oral traditions are still prized today with griots, and we see a picture of a griot here, who are poets and historians. One of the great stories from Mali, the Empire of Mali, is the Sundiata. And in the Sundiata, it is recounted by a griot who identifies himself and is immortalizing the adventures of Sundiata, the champion and founder of the Mali Empire. And in the tradition of Western heroes like Gilgamesh, Achilles, Alexander, and Roland, the lion child Sundiata performs extraordinary deeds that bring honor and glory to himself and peace and prosperity to his people. In ancient African rituals, we find various kinds of chants performed by shamans and priests, and also by non-professionals. They are working in dance and in mime. Um, it's obviously we see the beginnings of modern music and Afro-pop music in their polyrhythmic beats and drums. Poets are addressing the fragility of human life, celebrating the transition from one stage of growth to another, and they are encountering the experiences of everyday life and praising heroes and rulers. I think there are some pretty African myths that are presented in this. One of the myths explaining death says that to a couple that they can either live forever and then when they get old they will be regenerated into youth, or they can have children and they will die. And the couple decides to have children because they're lonely, they need help with the chores, and that is a myth that describes death. And again, I think that we find these origin myths everywhere, and I think they're always very fascinating. Now, the types of instruments that are coming from Africa include a kind of type of xylophone, the bolin or a large harp, the sanza, a instrument consisting of a number of metal tongues attached to a small wooden soundboard that is usually accompanied in storytelling and has such potent supernatural power, it was considered dangerous and outlawed in some African tribes except for griots. Here again, like we have seen in other lectures, a suspicion of instruments and not the human voice. Also used by griots, Africa is the origin of the banjo, which will ultimately make its way to the United States, probably on slave ships in the 1500s. We've looked at African sculpture, we've looked at African architecture. We, of course, are going to have to deal with slavery in the coming chapters and what that means. We have certainly talked about slavery in older forms of the Greeks and the Romans as well, but here we're seeing slavery taking place with a ethnicity that is happening between Europeans. And also, Muslims also keep slaves as well. And in fact, one of the ways to not become a slave when you are about to be conquered by Muslims is to make sure that you convert to Islam. You cannot be a slave if you are a Muslim. However, trying to convert after you are a slave is considered ingenuous. This, of course, leads to the African diaspora that is going to change the very face of Western humanity, from Cuba to New Orleans in the United States, and all of that we will be discussing in further chapters. Our textbook also talks about the complex Native American cultures with diverse tribal loyalties, very much at one with nature. There are at least 1,000 individual societies that are ranging from the Pacific coast to tribal villages of more economic complexity in Zuni and Iraqi, the Iroquois, what Illinois is named for, and then also in Meso and Middle America as well. They are fashioning tools and weapons out of wood and stone and bone and volcanic glass. There are no wood-wheeled vehicles, and they are still making monumental architecture and really, really kind of cool stuff. They are holistic, animistic. They infuse their life with spirits, masks for shamans, geometric art. Here we see one of the Chicano figures, and also one of the masking figures for shamans who cure the sick, exorcise evil spirits, and predict future events. We have seen dance in our very first lecture when we looked at the eagle dance. In Pueblo monumental communal villages. We find evidence of things like the Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde that includes a protected cliff with a number of community buildings, and also kivas, large round chambers, mostly underground and roofed, used for religious and other ceremonial purposes. So we were talking about Native American culture here in Mesa Verde, where the Cliff Palace is. We see things like totem poles built in the West. And again, a people who the art that we would think as art today was never meant to be seen by outsiders. And when you see that art in museums, that is really offensive to Native Americans who have been pushed to extinction because of manifest destiny and Europeans arriving and claiming the entity of this continent from east to west. In Mesoamerica, we're finding great cultures like the Olmecs, a pre-writing civilization. They have a city called La Venta. They were mound builders. They were working in gold for their artwork, from small pieces of jewelry to ritual weapons. Gold is associated with the sun and the radiance giving life to crops, with the gods whose blood in the form of rain was considered procreative. These societies are also going to use sacrificial rites and human blood to repay the god to save the world from destruction. So gold, like blood, was a medium of choice for glorifying the gods and will be used for warfare, or I guess a reason for warfare is to get prisoners for blood sacrifices. So from the Olmecs, we also have a great city called Teotihuacan that is named by the Aztecs. We're not 100% sure who built Teotihuacan, but there were around 100,000 people that lived here. This was a city complex with a number of pyramids, the largest being the Temple of the Sun, and then also the Temple of the Moon, that were named by the Aztecs, who begin to inhabit this probably around 400 or 500 years after it was sacked and systematically burned and abandoned. The Aztecs believe that this city was built by the gods. With the Mayans and also with the Aztecs, we have various gods, and these gods are including a sun god and a moon god, a feathered serpent, a puma god, and again, we see evidence of the gods in Teotihuacan. In Mayan civilization, that had a classic phase from 250 to 900 CE in Mexican, Honduras, and Guatemala. The Olmec people ultimately kind of fall away in their influence, and we get to the Mayans. The Mayans are pyramid builders. They have a ball game that we also see from the Olmecs with the leather helmet. In this ball game, a bladder is inflated. It's fairly heavy, and without using their hands, they have to keep the ball from hitting the ground. The Mayans also were writers. They also understood the stars and had observatories. Their great codexes include the Popol Vuh, which is a creation of the world, fashioning humans out of corn, and because the gods want someone to worship them. And they found that the other attempts of animals and mudmen and wooden men had proved unsuccessful because they lacked speech, souls, and intelligence. So, in other words, people are made out of corn so somebody can praise these gods, which is, I think, amazing. The Aztecs are the latest of the Mesoamerican cultures. They build their city in Lake Texcoco. They build it on the lake. So they drive trees into the lake, build platforms, build pyramids, and have a very thriving community. They do not adopt the Mayan writing and stay on as an oral society. Much of what we know about them was written down and illustrated by Aztecs after they had been conquered by the Spanish, and somewhat written down in a way kind of showing how the new Catholic Spanish Mesoamerica is superior to the pagan Aztecs. But what we do have is we do have an idea of what the culture was and also the kind of ritual garb that they wore. Otherwise, much of the Aztec culture is completely wiped out by the Spanish. The capital of Tenochtitlan is completely wiped out. Really, no evidence of it other probably than some of the poles that were embedded into Lake Texcoco. We have some great works of art that survived that were buried and hidden from the Spanish, like the Sunstone, a giant monolith with the face of a solar deity, showing a human heart in each of the clawed hands, and a tongue represented by stone sacrificial knife, expressing the need for sacrifices to allow for the sun to continue to move. It is a solar calendar that we don't know exactly totally what it is. Another found artifact is Quetzalcoatl. This is a major deity in the Aztec pantheon, the Earth Mother, represented as an old woman that has a head of two serpents facing each other, a pendant of human heads with a necklace of human hands, and claws on her hands and on her feet. She was that were used to rip up human corpses before they eat them. We think also she is part of the bloodletting, and probably also bloodletting that is understood as part of women's menstruational cycles as well. Cortez is ultimately going to conquer the Spanish, and we will get then a kind of new world mixture of the Baroque that we'll be studying in our next lecture, and then kind of flattened, more geometric artwork that we see from the Aztecs and Native Americans, and also from the Incas as well. In the 20th century, we get great muraling in a modern Mexico that ultimately is going to find its independence. Muralists like Diego Rivera are going to be looking at other ideologies, economic ideologies like Marxism, and celebrating workers rather than the wealthy. Jose Orozco is going to do murals looking at a pre-Columbian Mexico. And then today in California, and especially in Los Angeles, we have a great history of Mexican American and Mexican artists. This is a conceptual group called ASCO or BLA. One they famously did was tag the outside of the LA County Art Museum as a protest saying, you show a lot of Mayan and Olmec art, but you don't show any contemporary Mexican art. So the closest we'll get to being in your museum is tagging the outside of the museum. They have been canonized now and also have been in the museum as well. Ruben Ortiz Torres creates a mechanical sculpture, this lowrider hydraulic influenced car called Space Patrol, an alien toy that has no engine but breaks apart and spins, and I think is maybe one of the greatest sculptures of the late 20th century. In LA today, because of the Charlie James Gallery, Ramiro Gomez is documenting the workers that make the modernist LA homes look so good. He is now known as J. Lynn Gomez. Patrick Martinez is another one of Charlie James's great artists. He is working in neon as well as recreating peachy folders that kids had from his youth. Using wood panels, he is recreating and creating the kind of walls that you might see in Alhambra or East LA. And also mixing older motifs as well. Mario Ayala is one of my favorite painters working in the airbrush, celebrating Mexican culture. And a slide that I have to add in is Mr. Cartoon. I just saw his show recently at the Control Gallery at 434 West La Brea, or North La Brea, one of the two. It's 434 La Brea. And the show that I saw, to me, shows Mr. Cartoon is perhaps the greatest airbrush artist of this or any era, as he celebrates Mexican culture on canvas and also on cars. There is a 39 Chevrolet there that would have been used by gangsters running alcohol that he has restored as a lowrider with hydraulics and also painted, that I think is the greatest work of art that is a conflux of top flight Chevrolet manufacturing in the Art Deco streamlined style with the top line of restoration of cars in lowrider culture and the top airbrush painting and painting a car. I think it is the most spectacular functional work of art I may have ever seen. Mario Ibarra is another, I think, great artist. I saw him actually yesterday in Long Beach. He is a really important artist and also makes my favorite drawings in Los Angeles. His installations deal with Mexican culture, Mexican youth, and the difficulties of navigating poverty in the barrios and achieving success in life, which he has helped an awful lot of people achieve. Carla Diaz, Mario's wife, I think is making spectacular paintings celebrating what life is for women in Mexican culture in Los Angeles. Narcisco Martinez is an immigrant who is drawing and painting on the boxes that immigrants are using when they are picking fruit for very, very low wages, and also not being accepted for this really important labor that they do to keep us all fed with affordable fruits and vegetables. The last thing that our chapter mentioned were the Incas. And the Incas in 1000 CE were one of many small warring people who had settled in the mountainous regions along the west coast of South America, established in the Andes mountain of Peru. They had fine pottery, richly woven textiles, sophisticated metalwork, and they become the mightiest power in South America before the Spanish. They build roads over about their empire extends over around 3,000 miles. They are building roads, and they have about 16 million people in their civilization. They lacked writing, but kept a system of records on knotted and colored cords known as quipas. And they also had festivals of sacrifices and where children and llamas and guinea pigs are offered to the gods. One of their temples and fortresses is Machu Picchu, which we're seeing here. It is a 3-mile square city that straddles 2 high peaks. with little more than heavy stone hammers. They raised two-story buildings. And this civilization was kept secret from the Spanish and not discovered until late 1800s, early 1900s. I don't have the exact date in front of me. And this is where the film that we're going to watch, the Agir, the Wrath of God, the opening sequence is happening on this mountain here. Mist covering here, totally clear over here, two different weather patterns that are divided by this mountain. So we're going to watch this film. I want to give you just a little bit of a kind of synopsis on the film and also Werner Herzog. He is, again, one of the great filmmakers in the new German cinema. He has made films like Fitzcarraldo, where he drags a giant ship up a mountain and literally does it. There is no CGI. Nosferatu the Vampire is a 1979 West German horror film written by Herzog, and it is spectacular, starring the actor Klaus Kinski, who is also in Agir. I'm going to show you just a small scene from this. So what we're going to see here is the door open by itself, a shadow out in the hallway, the door will close, and the shadow appears on the wall. We never see anyone enter. Klaus Kinski, as the vampire, will make this dramatic entrance. And here's just a snippet of it.
You must excuse my rude entrance. I'm Count Dracula.
I know of you from Jonathan's diary. Since he has been with you, he's ruined.
He will not.
So he is going to try to get her to make an alliance with him. She will refuse. She's wearing a cross on her. And as he retreats in another spectacular way, but kind of with this weird kind of crying, grunting sound that I think is worth looking at.
Stir me. Good night.
Great telling of the vampire film. In a different class, I'm actually showing the history of vampire films that leads to the romantic of Twilight films, and I hope the students this term enjoy that. So he's a documentary filmmaker. He is the guy that made the documentary on the cave Chevi, which we studied in our first chapter. It's called Cave of Forgotten Dreams. He also, in 1972, makes a historical drama called Agir, the Wrath of God, which shows us, again, Klaus Kinski as in an insane, going insane, trying to find a city that doesn't exist, the gold city of El Dorado. We see slaves, we see ritualistic abuse, and everybody is going to die from either the jungle killing them, invisible natives shooting arrows at them, and at the end, everybody that's left on their raft is dying of disease. And a spoiler, but we're not watching it for that. We're watching it to see how this film, using a kind of documentary sensibility, really gives us the feeling that we're really there, and this is more of a documentary than a film. This is what the film climaxes at, with Agir, with the end of his expedition clearly imminent, but he is too insane from fever and greed to give up.
Der Zorn Gottes. Werde meine eigene Tochter heiraten und mit ihr die reinste Dynastie gründen, die je die Erde gesehen hat. Zusammen werden wir über diesen ganzen Kontinent herrschen. Wir halten durch. Ich bin der Zorn Gottes. Wer sonst ist mit mir?
Completely insane, completely gone insane, talking to nobody, marrying his daughter who has been killed already. He still is so single-minded in achieving his dream of wealth and becoming a great ruler. Now, what you might find interesting if you like the film, if you're interested in his filmmaking, I have a link to a great documentary called My Best Fiend that talks about how difficult it was to work with Klaus Kinski, and that Klaus, the reason he's so good at playing an insane character, well, he might be a bit insane himself. And I think that you might find it really, really interesting. So what we're seeing is fact and fiction combined in this film to make, again, a film that I'm guessing a lot of you who consume media, who are used to CGI and used to, films with larger budgets, this is definitely not that film. But part of what I'm hoping to do is to expand what you know about film by watching something probably that you haven't seen before, to see a different kind of filmmaking that is not about lots of explosions, but about a lot of quiet time, a lot of time for you as the viewer to be introspective as you're watching the film. So in this assignment, I want you to write about the film, how you feel about the film, why the jungle is maybe even a character in the film itself, and how does this film help us better visualize slavery and colonialism. So I look forward to seeing what you have to say. Very excited to introduce Herzog to you. I think he is still one of the great filmmakers today, and I highly recommend checking out more of his films. Talk to you soon.